TDS just had a crazy overhaul, not as crazy as overhaul in 2020, but still a pretty crazy one, which left the community in absolute shambles because there's simply so much that we don't know yet. And although I think the community is taking this rebalance the wrong way, because when can things ever last forever, on the contrary, I do believe understanding the new meta is important in the upcoming era of TDS. And honestly, from what we understand right now, it's not as complicated as you think. In order to understand, we're going to go over important before, current, and future TDS metas to help you grasp every new change. We'll help you adapt in these new times, ranging from tower use to things like how many players you should be playing with in whatever game mode you should be playing, especially since modes have been rebalanced or added since the meta has been like this. Hit the subscribe button while you're at it. We're trying to reach 10k subs and we've got some things planned for that occasion and would love for you to stay around. Diving straight into it, what was the TDS meta like 3 years ago? Because Seb, you're really trying to make everything sound simple, so can you prove it's really that simple? Well, yes it is. Look, if we take a look at the game modes and their wave structures from 3 years ago, like the 2022 to 2023 era, you'll realize that there wasn't much enemy spam and they heavily focus on higher health enemies and bosses to make each game mode harder. We'll go through each example thoroughly, but look, in Molten Wave Structure and Post Enemies Beta Update October 2022, Wave 10 only featured 8 normals and 1 normal boss, Wave 25 had 12 Moltens, 2 Slows, and 2 Necromancers, and lastly, Wave 40 only had 10 Moltens, 5 Molten Titans, and 1 Molten Boss. Throw those guys in nowadays, and it'd feel both underwhelming and like easy pickings. The issue is, although the just mentioned enemies have lower health than some of the spam newer ones, we have to account for power creep when looking back to the past. Accelerator and Engineer were on top of the world because they were the only gem towers that dealt so much DPS at once. But nowadays, there are plenty of accessible options other than those two that could get the job done in Molten.
Magically change into Biff and boom! Let's talk about some pros this meta had to it, despite feeling very old. This made the game a lot more friendly to beginners because there weren't so many enemies they had to deal with at once, and although a lot of towers weren't necessarily amazing for pros, they were still easily sufficient enough for beginners to progress. Secondly, which is very similar, but appealed to more casual players or players that didn't just play TDS all day long. Maybe I'm biased on this one, but since I personally didn't just play TDS like many other Roblox players, being able to efficiently keep up with the game with its simple to understand mechanics, whether it's survival or event game modes, was nice. Lastly, and probably the most important, it heavily encouraged players to play with each other, specifically up to trios and squads. I find this extremely valuable because this truly made TDS come around full circle, where you got to meet new people that also enjoyed the game, play a few matches, buy new towers, etc. Nothing was better than obtaining Engineer with none other than Biff rather than on my own when I got Accelerator. I feel like he forgot to change it because I'm Biff and I'm reading this part. Although, of course, there are some drawbacks to this. It was nice that TDS was friendly to beginners, but this era imposed a lot of issues with pros because not only did it feel like they weren't prioritized as much, since the game modes weren't insanely difficult, especially with other players, but getting randomly queued with a player not as sufficient as yourself, mainly referring to level, was very common, and not everyone had access to the TDS Discord server to look for pros that were also in need of teammates. Speaking of Discords, you can join ours in the link in the description. Unfortunately though, this also leads to another con of TDS being a strategy game, but not really encouraging much strategy to happen with the easier survival game modes. The special game modes were for sure a fun challenge themselves when they came out, but those got solved quickly and document strategies dominated them too. Don't get me wrong, it's hard to avoid this whole not that strategic allegation when you have insanely talented players cracking the code and distributing it publicly, but it would have been nice to see a push for more difficulty in the main game modes, as well as perhaps more beginner and pro distinction in things like events, which they did successfully get around to eventually.
So, over time, what had actually changed? Well, I'm gonna call it the big 2025 meta since it basically died in the beginning of the grand 2026, so yes we, are leaving it in the big 2025. Anyway, if you watched the modern perfect TDS loadout, go check it out after this. If not, you'd know I absolutely glaze Splash Tower since I claimed that the wave structure meta nowadays, well I guess back then, now, were heavily centered around spamming a ton of lower health enemies with loads of modifiers to make them tougher than they actually appeared. This made it harder for the previously overpowered Accelerator and Engineer to shine respectively, so we saw light to things like Crowd Control, yes to you guys my Corso fans, and towers like Mortar, Rocketeer, my personal fave, Mercenary Base, you name them. And although the community struggled to understand this in late 2024/early 2025, lots came round to it and stuck with the times. Before this overhaul, you could expect 5 nimble heavies, 8 hiddens, and 1 elite of normal by wave 10, this many freaking enemies by wave 25, and that many by the last wave, wave 35. Now, that's a lot to process, but do you see what I mean by enemy spam? Either way, here are the main pros of this meta. It made things more strategic, especially to a solo level, not the anime. People have been tired of having to rely on randomly queued teammates to even hope to triumph in a game mode like Badlands, and just ended up being queued with players way worse than they were, both level and experience-wise. Now that there were many great towers you could utilize, you could solo a ton of game modes, almost all of them at one point, all on your own, as long as you had the right strategy. Secondly, it significantly benefited game grinders that racked up tons of literally anything you could name, coins, gems, levels, so they could be ultimately prepared for the next update. At least I see this as a pro, and although I can agree this meta was fairly fun for many other reasons I could come up with, there were definitely some caveats to this. When I said this meta made things more strategic, it definitely did, only to a certain degree. Inevitably, testers were able to use the perfect configuration of towers on every game mode on their own, created, and then distributed document strategies to the public, allowing everyone to keep up with the new things in-game. And although I'm not 100% opposed to document strategies, having used them myself because they're nice for casual players, it definitely killed the actual enjoyment in the game. And this really may be about the type of player you are, but for me and many others, TDS felt dull for this. But to blame was mostly especially the solo aspect of this meta, because myself and many others didn't find the need to play with other players if we could do it all on our own. And without that interaction, TDS just never felt the same.
Sup, Biff again. But fast forward to now.
Why do you swear now?
Even though the meta only changed within a singular day, we're here! But are we back to our 2023 roots? Not particularly. Although, I would definitely agree that the wave structure has reverted back to a higher health enemy. HP scaling is much higher with more players, and many enemies have had HP changes. With reduced amount of enemies, I think we're actually expecting to be in the middle of both underwhelming waves from 2023 to enemy spam era from years like 2025. Immediately off the bat, when streaming the new update, I could tell waves from Fallen and Frosted felt a lot more underwhelming than usual, but I had to feel alert since the early game was definitely much harder than the late game, so it almost felt like a perfectly balanced experience. Because TDS felt more boring to play back then with slow pacing, low amount of enemies, and lack of interesting enemies, but with modes before overhaul, it veered to the exact opposite end. Since we're basically in the middle, I feel like this is going to be a great change for what's coming. What I've basically told you is that the actual wave structure of game modes isn't what we should be worried about for the changing meta, it's about how we combat playing those game modes in the first place. And yes, this is what I've stated from the intro, and you better not have skipped here! But anyway, tower, map, and party selection should be your main priorities instead of figuring out new game modes. If I had to urge you towards one, I'd recommend figuring out all the towers first. A ton, and I mean a ton of them got tweaks and adjustments, mainly placement limit being affected. So experiment with them in sandbox mode, finally have a use for that thing, and in actual gameplay to figure out what works for you. Or if it's not really a great tower. Since the meta likes high health enemies now, you should stick to high damage single target towers like the Accelerator. But don't veer too far and not accommodate for any splash either. Expect all towers to have increased damage since the meta has still shifted closer to higher health enemies. Other stats follow their own trends, but I'd venture to bet that the fire rate has been reduced slightly to accommodate for more damage. Secondly, party selection is an important thing to consider now. I did tell you that the meta leaned towards and favored solo players for quite some time recently, but is it the same story now? Yes! And no. I mean, I just told you we're kinda in the middle from now on, so it'd make sense that you won't see much trouble trying to beat game modes like Molten or above with another player helping ya. You may struggle as a beginner with not as many towers, but now with another player helping you. But now that towers like Crook Boss, Cowboy, Shotgunner, Military Base, and Rocketeer are either rebalanced and great, or still just great, and it may be a slower journey than before. Regardless, you can definitely survive doing modes like Casual or Intermediate with other players if Molten and Beyond is too difficult. However, for the tens of thousands of pros out there, if you're fine off playing with just one more person while trying to beat Molten and Beyond, for solo enjoyers, I'm sorry, but that seems hard even with the greatest towers to solo on your own, at least at the moment.
Which is why you should be expecting the same pros and cons I listed from the UNC 2023 meta to apply for the future, minus the tweaked matchmaking and non-strategic gameplay. Hopefully it will stay in that balance instead of swaying to one side or the other. For now, there's all your metas covered for TDS, but since it could change a lot due to its newborn state, we'll have to see if any additional videoing from us about this overhaul is necessary. This is a better change for TDS, and if you don't like not being used to TDS, it'll come back, don't worry. Leave comments for any questions, and again, don't forget to subscribe and please watch more of our content. Have a wonderful day.